The forbidden taste. When a Japanese female POW first drank Coca-Cola and broke down in tears, the glass bottle felt cold against her trembling fingers. Nurse Yuki Tanaka, prisoner number 4729, stared at the dark liquid inside with a mixture of confusion and terror. The American guard had placed it on the wooden table in front of her without a word. Just a slight nod and something that might have been a smile. But Yuki didn't understand smiles anymore. She didn't understand kindness. After 3 years of war, 2 years of brutal combat nursing in the Pacific Theater, and 6 months of expecting execution in this strange California prison camp, she had forgotten what gentleness looked like. The bottle sat there, sweating condensation in the September heat of 1945. Other Japanese women in the mess hall had stopped eating their lunch to watch. Yuki could feel their eyes burning into her back. She could hear the whispers in Japanese, quick and nervous. "Don't drink it. It could be poison. They're testing something on her." Remember what they told us about American savagery, but Yuki was thirsty. God, she was so thirsty. The kind of thirst that made your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth. The kind that made you dream about mountain streams back in Hokkaido, about the cold water from the well behind her family's house, about her mother's green tea served in porcelain cups that were probably ash now, just like everything else. Her hands shook as she lifted the bottle. The guard, young, maybe 22, with freckles and red hair that reminded her of autumn leaves, watched with an expression she couldn't read. Not hostile, not cruel, just waiting. That's when something nobody expected happened. The moment the sweet, fizzing liquid touched her lips, Yuki's entire body went rigid. The carbonation stung her tongue, the sugar exploded across her taste buds like a bomb, and the cold, the blessed, impossible cold, rushed down her throat like salvation. And she began to cry, not quiet tears, not dignified sadness. Yuki Tanaka, who had held dying soldiers in her arms without flinching, who had amputated limbs with a bone saw, who had walked through fields of corpses without breaking stride, collapsed forward onto the table and sobbed like a child. The Coca-Cola bottle slipped from her fingers and would have shattered on the floor if the guard hadn't caught it with reflexes honed by baseball games back in Iowa. The other Japanese women gasped. Some moved forward to help, but Yuki's crying was so raw, so primal that they froze. She couldn't stop. The tears came in waves, each one carrying 3 years of horror she'd buried so deep she thought it had turned to stone. But that single sip of Coca-Cola had cracked something open inside her, and now everything was pouring out. The guard, whose name was Private James McCarthy, stood there helplessly, the bottle still in his hand, looking around for assistance. He'd been told these Japanese POWs were dangerous, fanatical, that they'd been taught Americans were demons. He'd been warned they might try to kill themselves rather than face the shame of capture. Nobody had warned him about this. Nobody had warned him that a simple bottle of Coke would break a woman in half. But the real shock was yet to come. Because when Yuki finally lifted her head, mascara, they'd given them makeup, actual makeup, like they were humans, not prisoners, streaking down her cheeks. She looked at the young private and whispered in broken English, "My brother. My little brother Kenji. He dreamed about this." 3 years earlier, Tokyo, spring 1942, Kenji Tanaka was 11 years old when he saw his first Coca-Cola bottle. It was in a photograph, a forbidden American magazine that his teacher, Mr. Watanabe, had confiscated from another student and was about to burn. But Kenji caught a glimpse of it, a perfect glass curve, red and white label, held by a smiling American boy in a baseball uniform. The image lasted only seconds before the magazine went into the fire, but it burned itself into Kenji's memory. "Sister," he had whispered to Yuki that night, crawling into her room after their parents were asleep. "Do you think it's true what they say? That Americans drink something that bubbles like champagne but isn't alcohol? That it's sweet like candy but cold like snow?" Yuki, who was 19 and training to be a nurse, had pulled her little brother close. "Kenji, you mustn't talk about such things. It's dangerous now. The neighbors—" I know." His voice dropped even lower. "But sister, do you think after we win the war maybe Japan will make something like that? Something that makes you happy just to drink it?" She had laughed then, her last real laugh for years. "What makes you think a drink can make you happy?" Kenji's eyes had been so serious, so old for 11. Because in the picture, sister, everyone was smiling. Not the fake smiles we do now at the rallies. Real smiles. The kind we used to have before Father went to Manchuria. That conversation haunted Yuki now, sitting in this American mess hall with that same impossible drink in front of her. Because Kenji never got to taste it. Kenji never got to know that the bubbles did exist, that the sweetness was real, that something so simple could indeed feel like happiness. Kenji died in the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, along with their mother, their grandmother, and 100,000 others. Their father had already been dead 2 years, killed in Burma. Yuki only knew because a letter had found her in the Philippines, where she'd been stationed as a military nurse. The letter came 3 weeks after the firebombing. By the time she read it, she was already captured by American forces, already expecting execution, already convinced her entire family was ash. The guard, James, was kneeling beside her now, and Yuki realized she'd been talking in Japanese without realizing it, explaining about Kenji, about the photograph, about dreams of sweetness in a world that had forgotten sugar. James didn't understand the words, but he understood grief. He'd lost his own brother at Guadalcanal. So he did something that broke every regulation he'd been given. He opened a second bottle of Coca-Cola and held it out to her. "Here," he said softly. "Drink it slow this time. It's yours." Yuki looked at the bottle, then at him, then back at the bottle. The other Japanese women were watching, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Lieutenant Yamada, the highest-ranking prisoner among them, stood up from her table, her spine rigid with military discipline. "Nurse Tanaka," she said sharply in Japanese. "Remember your training. Remember who you are." But Yuki was so tired of remembering, tired of being the Imperial Japanese Navy nurse who had sworn to die rather than surrender, tired of being the good daughter who'd sent fake cheerful letters home while sewing up boys who screamed for their mothers, tired of being strong when everything inside her had shattered like porcelain. She took the bottle. This time she drank slowly. The carbonation still surprised her, still made her eyes water, but now she could taste the complexity of it. The caramel undertones, the vanilla hint, the way the bubbles seemed to dance on her tongue before disappearing. It was cold. They had refrigeration here, actual refrigeration, something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. The mess hall had electric lights that didn't flicker. The plates they ate from weren't dented metal but actual ceramic. There were napkins. Paper napkins that you could throw away after one use, and that's when something nobody expected happened. Yuki started to laugh. Not the polite Japanese laugh, hand over mouth, quiet and controlled, but a real, deep, almost hysterical laugh that mixed with her tears until she didn't know which was which. Because the absurdity of it all crashed over her like a wave. She had survived the war, survived battles, bombings, starvation, and capture. She had expected to be tortured, executed, used as a propaganda tool at best. Instead, she was sitting in a clean mess hall, drinking Coca-Cola, while a kind American guard looked at her with concern instead of hatred. The other women were staring now, some with horror, some with confusion, and Lieutenant Yamada was moving toward her with clear intent to restore order. But before she could reach Yuki, something extraordinary happened. Another Japanese woman, Corporal Sachiko Hayashi, a radio operator who'd been captured in the Philippines, stood up from her table, walked over to the guard, and pointed at the Coca-Cola crate. Her voice was steady, her English surprisingly good. May I please try one also?" James looked at her, then at Yuki, then at the dozen other Japanese women who were slowly, hesitantly standing up. He was just a private. He wasn't authorized to make this kind of decision. But he was 22 years old, far from home, and he'd just watched a woman cry over something he'd taken for granted his entire life. He'd drunk Coca-Cola at birthday parties, at baseball games, on hot summer days without ever thinking it was special. He'd never imagined it could mean something like this. "Sergeant," he called out. "Sergeant Miller, we've got a situation here." Sergeant Frank Miller, a 40-year-old career soldier from Texas who'd seen combat in North Africa before being reassigned to POW duty, came over expecting trouble. What he found was 32 Japanese women standing in a loose semicircle, all looking at a crate of Coca-Cola like it was holy. And one woman still crying, still laughing, holding an empty bottle like it was made of gold. "Private McCarthy," Miller said slowly. his Texas drawl thick with confusion. What in the Sam Hill is going on here? Sergeant, She just wanted a drink. I gave her a Coke. She started crying. Now they all want to try it. I didn't mean to. Miller held up a hand. He'd been in this camp for 3 months, ever since the Japanese surrender. He'd been briefed on these women, nurses, radio operators, clerks, even a few pilots. Fanatics, he'd been told. Dangerous. But all he saw now were scared. Thin women who'd survived hell and were looking at bottles of soda like they'd never imagined such things existed. Things were just starting to look better when Miller made a decision that would change everything in that camp. Private, open the crate. Every woman here gets a bottle, but they drink it here, supervised, and they drink it slow. I don't want anyone getting sick from the sugar or the carbonation. Understood? Yes, Sergeant. What happened next would become legend in the camp. As James started handing out bottles, some of the women approached cautiously, like they were approaching a wild animal. Others hung back, torn between desire and duty. Lieutenant Yamada remained seated, her face a mask of disapproval, but even she couldn't stop watching. The first woman to drink after Yuki was Sachiko, the radio operator. She'd learned English from her grandmother, who'd lived in Hawaii. She'd loved American music before the war, before it became forbidden, before everything became forbidden. When the Coca-Cola hit her tongue, Sachiko's eyes went wide. "Oh," she breathed in English. "Oh, it's real. It's all real." Then she looked at Yuki and switched to Japanese. Everything they told us was lies. If this is real, what else was real? What else did they lie about? That question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Because these women had been taught that Americans were savages who would rape them, torture them, eat them. They'd been given cyanide capsules, Yuki still had hers, hidden in the hem of her dress, and told that death was preferable to capture. They'd been shown propaganda films of American atrocities. They'd been trained to believe that surrender meant horror beyond imagination. And now they were drinking Coca-Cola in a clean mess hall, while guards with freckles made sure they didn't drink too fast. The next morning, Yuki woke up before dawn with a strange sensation in her stomach. Not pain exactly, but an unfamiliar fullness. The Coca-Cola had been sweet, so impossibly sweet compared to the watery rice and bland vegetables they'd been eating for months. Her body wasn't used to sugar anymore. Most of the women had complained of stomach cramps during the night, but none of them regretted it. Not one. She lay on her bunk in Barracks 7, staring at the ceiling. The barracks were clean, almost absurdly so compared to the conditions she'd lived in during the war. Each woman had her own bed with actual sheets, a thin pillow, and a wool blanket. There were windows with screens to keep out insects. The floor was swept daily. It was better than many places she'd lived even before the war. Better than the nurses' quarters in the Philippines where they'd slept 4 to a room on straw mats. Where cockroaches the size of her thumb crawled over everything. Where the heat was so oppressive you couldn't breathe. But the real shock was yet to come. Because that morning, something happened that would change everything Yuki thought she knew about her captors. Breakfast was at 700 hours. The women lined up outside the mess hall as always, maintaining perfect military discipline even though the war was over, even though Japan had surrendered, even though Emperor Hirohito himself had spoken on the radio telling them to lay down their arms. Lieutenant Yamada insisted on it. "We are still soldiers of the Emperor," she would say. "Surrender does not mean we become animals." But this morning was different. When they entered the mess hall, the usual breakfast, rice porridge, pickled vegetables, weak tea, was not on the tables. Instead, there were plates, real plates with eggs, scrambled eggs piled high and steaming, toast with butter, actual butter, not the rancid margarine they'd been given occasionally. And there were small glasses of orange juice, bright and impossibly orange in the morning light. The women stopped, all 32 of them, frozen in the doorway like deer who'd spotted a hunter. Lieutenant Yamada's face went pale. "It's a trick," she whispered in Japanese. "Don't touch anything. This is a test." But Sergeant Miller was standing by the serving line, and he smiled, genuinely smiled, when he saw their reaction. "Good morning, ladies," he said, and Private Hideo, the translator, repeated it in Japanese. "We figured after yesterday's excitement with the Coca-Cola, you might appreciate a real American breakfast. It's not a trick. It's just food, good food. You're not prisoners of war anymore. You're people waiting to go home. And people deserve to eat like people. Yuki felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, crack. Like ice on a frozen lake when spring finally comes. Because those words, people waiting to go home, implied something she'd been too terrified to believe. They were actually going to let them go home. Not execute them. Not keep them as slaves. Not use them for medical experiments like the rumors said. They were going home. Sachiko, the radio operator who'd been second to try the Coca-Cola, was the first to move. She walked to the serving line, took a plate, and let an American soldier, a black soldier, which shocked some of the women who'd been told that Americans kept different races as slaves, pile eggs onto it. She sat down at a table, picked up a fork, and took a bite. Her eyes closed. A single tear ran down her cheek. "It's warm," she said in Japanese. "It's actually warm. When was the last time we ate hot food?" That broke the dam. The women surged forward, not rudely, but with barely contained desperation. They'd been existing on cold rice and pickles for so long that the smell of eggs and butter was almost overwhelming. Yuki found herself at a table with her plate loaded, staring down at food that looked like something from a dream. The eggs were fluffy, perfectly cooked. The toast was golden brown. There was even jam, strawberry jam in a small glass container that you could spread with a knife. She took a bite of toast, and the sweetness of the jam mixed with the richness of the butter exploded on her tongue. Her hands started shaking. She set the toast down and pressed her palms flat against the table, trying to steady herself. This wasn't just food. This was proof of something she'd been taught was impossible, that the enemy could be kind. That the monsters in the propaganda films were actually just people. That everything she'd been told, everything she'd believed, everything she'd fought for, it was all built on lies. Sister would have loved this. The words came out before Yuki could stop them, spoken in Japanese to no one in particular. But Akiko, the nurse from Burma who sat across from her, heard. "You have a sister?" she asked. "Had. A brother, Kenji. He was 11. Yuki's voice was flat, emotionless, the way it always was when she talked about the dead. "He died in the Tokyo firebombing. He used to dream about American things, movies, cars, and Coca-Cola. He saw it in a magazine once before they burned all the American magazines. He asked me if it was real, if something could really taste like happiness. I told him it was probably propaganda, that Americans probably didn't have such things, that our teachers were right about American weakness and decadence." Akiko set down her fork. "How old was he when he died?" 14. "I had a son," Akiko said quietly. 7 years old. "The bombs hit Osaka when I was in Burma. My husband wrote me one letter after. He said our son asked for me before he died. Asked when Mama was coming home from the war. She picked up her orange juice, stared at it like it was poison. I told my son the emperor needed me more than he did. I told him Mama was being a hero. What kind of mother says that?" The table fell silent. Other women nearby had stopped eating to listen. This was dangerous talk. Defeatist talk. The kind that could get you arrested by the military police back home. But there were no military police here. There was just Sergeant Miller refilling coffee cups, and Private McCarthy bringing out more toast, and the morning sun coming through clean windows that had screens to keep out the flies. And that's when something nobody expected happened. Lieutenant Yamada stood up. Every woman in the mess hall turned to look at her. Yamada was 43 years old, a career military officer, one of the first women allowed into the Imperial Japanese Navy's administrative corps. She'd been captured while evacuating documents from Manila. For 6 months, she'd maintained iron discipline among the prisoners, refusing to cooperate with interrogations, leading them in morning exercises, keeping them focused on duty and honor. She'd been their rock, their anchor, the one who reminded them who they were. She walked slowly to the serving line, took a plate, and allowed an American soldier to serve her eggs. Then she walked back to her table, sat down, and before she took a bite, she said clearly in Japanese, loud enough for everyone to hear, "My daughter's name was Suki. She was 19. She wanted to be a teacher. She died in Hiroshima on August 6th. I received the telegram 3 days ago." She paused, looking down at her eggs. "The Americans who delivered the telegram said they were sorry for my loss. They said it in Japanese. They had learned the words specifically to tell me they were sorry." She picked up her fork. I don't know what to do with that information. The mess hall was so quiet you could hear the coffee percolating in the kitchen. Yamada took a bite of eggs, chewed slowly, swallowed. These are good eggs, she said. Better than anything we had even before the war when things were still good. When we still had coffee and sugar and electric lights that didn't flicker. She looked around at all of them. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if going home means arrest for surrender. I don't know if our families will forgive us for surviving. I don't know anything anymore, but I know these are good eggs. And the men who made them said they were sorry my daughter died. And I don't think they were lying. Things were just starting to look better when Private McCarthy approached Yuki's table with a strange expression on his face. He was carrying something wrapped in brown paper, and he looked nervous, like he was about to do something that might get him in trouble. Nurse Tanaka? He said, and Private Hideo translated. I went into town last night, to the PX, the store on base. I bought something, for you, because of what happened yesterday. With the Coca-Cola, he set the package on the table. Yuki stared at it, her heart hammering. Gifts from captors were dangerous. They created obligation. They complicated things. But her hands moved without permission, unwrapping the paper. Inside was a 6-pack of Coca-Cola bottles, still cold from the store's refrigerator. And underneath, wrapped separately, was a Hershey's chocolate bar. The chocolate, McCarthy said, his freckled face turning red. I thought, you said your brother dreamed about American things. I figured if the Coca-Cola meant that much, maybe. I don't know. It's stupid, sorry. He started to turn away. Wait. Yuki's voice stopped him. She picked up the chocolate bar, feeling the weight of it, reading the English words she couldn't understand. My brother, Kenji, he talked about chocolate too. He'd never tasted it. None of us had. It was forbidden during the war. Foreign luxury goods. But he'd heard about it from our grandmother, who'd traveled to Yokohama once when she was young and tasted chocolate in a Western hotel. She looked up at McCarthy, really looked at him for the first time. He was just a boy, younger than her, maybe the same age Kenji would have been if he'd lived. Why, she asked in halting English. Why you kind? McCarthy looked uncomfortable. My brother died at Guadalcanal, Danny. He was 20. The best guy you'd ever meet. Played baseball, loved jazz music, wanted to be a teacher when the war ended. He's buried somewhere in the Pacific, and I'll probably never find his grave. He paused, struggling with words. I figure somebody somewhere was kind to him before he died. Or I hope they were. Maybe gave him water when he was wounded, or said a prayer or something. So I figure, maybe that's how it works. You be kind when you can, and hope that somewhere, somebody was kind to someone you loved. Private Hideo translated, though his voice cracked on the last few words. Yuki felt tears coming again, but she pushed them back. She'd cried enough yesterday. Instead, she carefully unwrapped the chocolate bar, broke off a single square, and held it out to McCarthy. Share? She said in English. For Danny, for Kenji, for everyone. McCarthy's eyes went wide. He looked around nervously. Sharing food with prisoners was definitely against regulations, but Sergeant Miller was watching from across the room, and he just nodded once, barely perceptible. McCarthy took the chocolate square. To Danny and Kenji, he said softly. They ate the chocolate at the same time, and Yuki understood why Kenji had dreamed of it. The sweetness was different from the Coca-Cola, deeper, richer, more complex. It melted on her tongue, coating her mouth with flavor she had no words for. It tasted like everything the war had taken away. Luxury, peace, the possibility of joy. But the real shock was yet to come. Because that simple act, sharing chocolate with an enemy soldier, set off a chain reaction that would transform the entire camp. Other guards saw it happen. Other prisoners saw it happen. And slowly, carefully, like people learning to walk after a long illness, they began to talk to each other. Not as captors and prisoners, but as human beings who'd all survived the same terrible war. By lunchtime, Private Hideo, the translator, was exhausted from running between tables, facilitating conversations. Sachiko, who spoke English, became an informal interpreter. Women who'd maintained stony silence for 6 months began asking questions. What was America like? Did Americans really have radios in every home? Was it true there were roads that stretched for thousands of miles? Did ordinary people really own automobiles? The guards answered, sometimes with pride, sometimes with embarrassment when the gap between American plenty and Japanese suffering became too obvious. My family had a radio, Yuki found herself telling McCarthy during one of these conversations. Before the war, my father bought it in 1936, a huge luxury. We listened to music, news, everything. Then the war started and they took all the radios for the war effort. They melted them down for metal. My mother cried when they came for it, not because of the radio, because it meant things were getting bad. We have radios in our cars, McCarthy said, then immediately looked sorry he'd said it. But Yuki just laughed, that same half-hysterical laugh from yesterday. Of course you do. Of course Americans have radios in their cars. You probably have chocolate factories the size of our entire village. You probably throw away more food in a day than we ate in a month. She wasn't bitter, just stating facts. We were told you were weak because you had too much. That luxury made you soft, that you couldn't fight because you didn't know sacrifice. She gestured around the mess hall at the full plates, the coffee cups, the napkins. But you won. With all your luxury and softness, you still won. So maybe everything we were taught about strength was wrong too. The afternoon brought more surprises. After lunch, the women were told they had free time, a concept that seemed alien after years of military regimentation. Some returned to their barracks to rest, overwhelmed by the morning's emotional whiplash. But others, emboldened by breakfast and chocolate, began to explore the camp more freely than they had before. The Americans didn't stop them. There were guards, but they didn't raise weapons or shout. They just nodded as the women walked past, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Yuki found herself drawn to the camp's administrative building, where she'd been interrogated when she first arrived. The interrogation had been nothing like she'd expected. No torture, no beatings. Just an exhausted-looking officer asking questions in broken Japanese while she gave him name, rank and serial number over and over until he'd sighed and said she could go. But now she noticed something she hadn't seen then. There was a bulletin board outside the building, covered in notices in both English and Japanese. Red Cross messages, lists of survivors from various camps, information about repatriation, and, her heart nearly stopped, a map showing which Japanese cities had been bombed and to what extent. Tokyo was marked in red. Extensive damage. Casualty estimates 100,000 plus. That was Kenji. That was home. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had different markings. Total destruction. New weapon. Survivor lists incomplete. Yuki's hand reached out to touch the map, her fingers trembling. So many red marks. So many destroyed cities. So many dead. And she'd been here, eating eggs and drinking Coca-Cola, while her entire country burned. It's not your fault. The voice came from behind her. She turned to find Sergeant Miller standing there, his weathered face kind. Whatever you're thinking right now, that you should have been there, that you should have died with them, that you don't deserve to have survived, it's not true. You didn't start this war. You didn't choose any of this. I fought in it, Yuki said in halting English, words she'd learned from Sachiko over the past months. I help soldiers. I keep them alive so they kill more Americans. I am guilty? Miller was quiet for a long moment. My unit helped liberate a camp in France, he finally said. Concentration camp. You probably don't know what that means. Why would you? We didn't even know until we saw it. Jews, political prisoners, anyone the Nazis wanted dead. Starved, worked to death, murdered. Thousands of them. And the German guards, when we caught them, some of them said the same thing you just said. I was just doing my job. I was following orders. What choice did I have? He looked at Yuki directly. But here's the thing, you were a nurse. You saved lives. Even if those lives went back to fight, you saved them. That's different. That matters. Japanese nurses, we teach to fight too, Yuki admitted. I have gun training. I carry grenade. I am told if Americans come, I fight to death. I am told. She struggled for words, switched to Japanese, hoping Hideo might be nearby to translate. But Miller surprised her by responding in slow, careful Japanese. Not fluent, but understandable. You were told many things. Many lies. We all were. He pulled a photograph from his wallet. My daughter Susan, she's 8. When I enlisted, they told us Japanese soldiers were savages who'd rape and kill every woman in America if we didn't stop them. They told us you were barely human. I believed it. I needed to believe it. How else could I kill people? He put the photo away. But then I got assigned here. And I met women like you. Nurses, clerks, radio operators, scared, traumatized, missing their families. Just like our nurses, our clerks, our radio operators. Turns out propaganda sounds the same in every language. Yuki felt something shift inside her. A fundamental reordering of her understanding of the world. What happens now? She asked. To us. To Japan. To everything. Honestly? I don't know. The brass is figuring out repatriation. It'll take months, maybe longer. You'll go home eventually, but it won't be the home you remember. From what we're hearing, Japan is devastated. Food shortages, destroyed cities, millions dead. It's going to be a hard few years. He paused. But here's what I do know. You're not going to face that hungry. Not while you're here. Not on my watch. That evening, something extraordinary happened. Sergeant Miller arranged for a movie night in the camp's recreation building, a luxury previously reserved only for American personnel. The women filed in nervously, uncertain what to expect. The room had folding chairs set up in rows, and there was an actual movie projector, the kind Yuki had only seen once before the war at a theater in Tokyo. The film was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, a 1939 Jimmy Stewart movie about an idealistic senator fighting corruption. Private Hideo and Sachiko took turns translating whispered summaries as the film played. Yuki sat in the darkness, mesmerized. Not just by the movie, though the story of one man standing up against a broken system resonated in ways she couldn't fully process, but by what the movie represented. This was American culture, American values. The idea that one person could make a difference, that fighting authority was noble, that cynicism could be overcome. These were dangerous ideas in Japan, where individual will was supposed to be subsumed into collective duty. Yet here they were being shown this film by their captors, as if to say, this is what we believe. This is why we fought. When the movie ended, the women sat in silence for a long moment. Then Lieutenant Yamada stood up and, in her formal military Japanese, said something that shocked everyone. The man in the film, he did not obey. He questioned authority. He fought his superiors. In Japan, this would make him a traitor. But in this film, he is a hero, she paused. I am beginning to understand why we lost. The weeks that followed transformed the camp in ways no one could have predicted. What started with a bottle of Coca-Cola became something much larger, a careful, tentative bridge between two groups of people who'd been taught to hate each other. The American guards, many of them farm boys from Iowa and Texas who'd never left their home states before the war, found themselves genuinely curious about these Japanese women. And the women, stripped of the propaganda that had sustained them through years of war, began to see their captors not as demons, but as young men far from home, just as scared and damaged as they were. Private McCarthy became a regular visitor to the mess hall during the women's mealtimes. He'd bring small gifts, more Coca-Cola, chocolate bars, American magazines with their glossy pages and impossible advertisements. Yuki became his unofficial bridge to the other women, her English improving daily as Sachiko tutored her in the evenings. They'd sit at the long tables and McCarthy would answer questions that ranged from innocent to devastating. Is it true every American family has a car? Asked Nurse Emiko, who'd served in China and still bore shrapnel scars on her arms. Not every family, but most. My dad bought a Ford in 1938. Cost him $600, which was a lot, but he saved for 2 years. The women tried to comprehend this. $600 was more money than most of their families had seen in a lifetime. A car wasn't just luxury. It was unimaginable wealth. What do you do with car? Yuki asked, struggling with the words. Just to drive? McCarthy thought about it. Sure, driving, but also freedom, I guess. You can go anywhere. When I was 16, me and Danny, my brother, we drove from Iowa to California just to see the ocean. Took us 4 days. Slept in the car, ate sandwiches, sang songs on the radio. Dad was mad as hell when we got back, but it was worth it. His smile faded. Danny talked about doing it again after the war. Seeing the Pacific from the other side, he said. Guess he did, just not the way we planned. The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief. These women had all lost someone. Most had lost everyone. And sitting across from them was a boy who'd lost his brother to their military, yet was offering them chocolate and stories and kindness. The mathematics of war didn't account for this. The propaganda had no framework for understanding it. But the real shock was yet to come. 3 weeks after the Coca-Cola incident, on a crisp October morning, Sergeant Miller gathered all the women in the mess hall for an announcement. His face was serious, and fear rippled through the group. This was it, they thought. The kindness had been temporary. Now came the real punishment: execution, labor camps, medical experiments. Lieutenant Yamada stood straighter. Preparing to face death with dignity, ladies, Miller began, and Hideo translated. I've received orders from command regarding your status and repatriation. The women held their breath. The Red Cross has confirmed that all of you are classified as non-combatant personnel, nurses, administrative staff, radio operators. Under the Geneva Convention, you're to be repatriated to Japan as soon as shipping can be arranged. He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. That's going to take time. Maybe 2 months, maybe 6. Japan's infrastructure is destroyed. There aren't enough ships, and the ones we have are being used for priority repatriation of civilian prisoners from Japanese camps. So you'll be staying here for a while longer. Relief swept through the room like a physical wave. They were going home. They weren't going to die. But then Miller continued, and his next words changed everything. Here's the thing. You're not prisoners anymore. Technically, you're refugees under American protection. That means different rules. You'll still stay in the barracks for housing. We don't have anywhere else to put you, but you're free to move around the base during daylight hours. You can attend movies, use the library, even go to the base canteen if you want. He looked around at their shocked faces. I know this is strange. I know it goes against everything you were taught about Americans. But the war is over. We're not your enemies anymore. We're just people trying to get you home safely. The silence that followed was absolute. Finally, Lieutenant Yamada spoke, her voice careful and formal. Sergeant Miller, why do you do this? We fought against America. We killed American soldiers. By your laws, by any laws, we should be punished. Why instead do you give us freedom? Give us Coca-Cola and chocolate and movies? Why do you treat us like we matter? Miller's weathered face softened. Ma'am, I've been in this man's army for 20 years. I've seen combat in 2 theaters. I've watched good men die for bad reasons and bad men survive for no reason at all. I've seen enough death and suffering to last 3 lifetimes. He paused, choosing his words carefully. When this war started, it was easy to hate. The enemy was evil, we were good, everything was simple. But then I got assigned here and I met you all. And I realized something. You were just as lied to as we were. You were just as used. You thought you were fighting for your emperor, for your families, for survival. We thought we were fighting for freedom and democracy. Maybe both were true. Maybe neither was. But what I know for certain is this. Punishing you won't bring back the men we lost. Treating you like animals won't undo the war. But maybe, just maybe, if we show you that Americans can be decent people, you'll go home and tell others. And maybe that's how we prevent the next war. Yuki found tears streaming down her face again. She wasn't alone. Half the women in the room were crying, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of having everything they believed inverted in a matter of weeks. The Americans weren't monsters. The emperor wasn't a god. He'd surrendered, admitted defeat, a thing they'd been taught was impossible. Their sacrifice hadn't brought victory but destruction. And yet here they were, being treated with more dignity and kindness than many had experienced even in their own military. That afternoon, something nobody expected happened. Emboldened by Miller's announcement, several women ventured to the base canteen, a small store where American soldiers bought cigarettes, candy, magazines, and toiletries. The young corporal behind the counter looked startled when they entered, but he didn't order them out. Instead, he smiled nervously and said, "Can I help you, ladies?" Sachiko, serving as translator, pointed to a shelf of Coca-Cola bottles. "May we purchase some? We have money from our work assignments." The camp had started paying the women small amounts for helping in the laundry and kitchen. Not much, but enough for small luxuries. The corporal's face went through several expressions before settling on bemused acceptance. "Sure, why not? 15 cents a bottle," he paused. "But, if you're gonna drink them here, I gotta warn you. There's American soldiers in the back playing cards. Some of them might not be as friendly as Sergeant Miller's boys. We understand," Sachiko said with quiet dignity. "We will cause no trouble. They bought 6 bottles of Coca-Cola and sat at a small table near the window. Within minutes, curious American soldiers began drifting over. Some were hostile at first, muttering about Jap women and why are they even here? But others were curious, especially when they saw McCarthy and Miller's men vouching for them. Soon an impromptu cultural exchange was happening, awkward and stilted but genuine. A soldier from Brooklyn tried to explain baseball using napkins as bases. Yuki tried to explain the tea ceremony using Coca-Cola bottles and failed spectacularly, which made everyone laugh. A farm boy from Kansas showed them photos of his family's wheat fields, and Nurse Emiko responded with descriptions of her family's rice paddies in Niigata. The similarities were striking. Both talked about early mornings, hard work, the fear of bad weather destroying crops, the pride in feeding others. "My dad says farmers are the same everywhere," the Kansas boy said. "Don't matter if you're growing wheat or rice, beef or fish. You work with the land, you understand the land. The rest is just details." "My father say same thing," Emiko responded in halting English. "He say war is for politicians and generals. Farmers just want good harvest and family safe," her voice cracked. "He die in air raid. Never get to see peace," the soldier's face fell. "I'm real sorry, ma'am. That ain't right no matter which side you're on." These small moments, repeated dozens of times over the following weeks, created something unprecedented. The women weren't just prisoners waiting to go home anymore. They were people with stories, with families, with dreams that the war had stolen. And the American soldiers, many of whom had fought in the Pacific and harbored deep hatred for the Japanese, found that hatred harder to maintain when faced with individual human beings rather than faceless enemies. But not everyone was convinced. There were American soldiers who refused to acknowledge the Japanese women, who spat when they walked past, who muttered that they should all be executed as war criminals. And among the Japanese women, there were some, particularly older officers like Lieutenant Yamada, who struggled to reconcile this kindness with years of indoctrination about American savagery. Things were just starting to look better when an incident threatened to undo all the progress. It was mid-November, and the camp was preparing for Thanksgiving, a holiday the Japanese women had never heard of. Sergeant Miller had arranged for the women to join the regular Thanksgiving dinner in the main mess hall, a gesture meant to show unity and peace. But not everyone approved. Captain Robert Harrison, a combat veteran who'd lost half his platoon at Iwo Jima, stormed into Miller's office 3 days before Thanksgiving. "You're telling me we're going to sit down and share a holiday meal with Japs? Are you out of your goddamn mind, Sergeant?" "Sir, with respect, those women are refugees under our protection. They're being repatriated as soon as— I don't give a damn about protocol. Those people killed my men. I watched boys bleed out screaming for their mothers while Japanese soldiers charged us with bayonets, and you want me to pass them the goddamn gravy?" Miller stood his ground. "Sir, those women are nurses and clerks. They didn't charge anyone with bayonets. And those boys who died, they'd want us to be better than this. They'd want us to win the peace, not just the war. Don't you dare tell me what my dead men would want." Harrison's voice was ice. "You weren't there. You didn't watch them die." "No, sir, I wasn't. I was in North Africa watching different boys die. And then France. And then here, watching Japanese POWs starve themselves because they believed we'd torture them. I've seen enough death to know that more hate doesn't honor anyone's sacrifice." The argument ended with Harrison storming out, but the damage was done. Word spread through the American ranks that some of the officers opposed the Thanksgiving inclusion. Suddenly the camp was divided, those who'd come to see the Japanese women as people, and those who still saw them as the enemy. The tension grew so thick you could taste it. Yuki heard about the conflict from McCarthy, who looked miserable as he explained it. "I don't know if the Thanksgiving thing is going to happen," he admitted. "Captain Harrison is threatening to file a formal complaint. And honestly, a lot of the guys agree with him. They lost friends, family. It's hard for them to separate you from the soldiers who killed people they loved." "I understand," Yuki said quietly. "We feel same. Many of us lose family to American bombs. My brother died in Tokyo fire raid. Akiko's son died in Osaka. Lieutenant Yamada's daughter died in Hiroshima. We know Americans do this, but we also know you, James, Sergeant Miller, others. You are kind. You not kill our families. War kill our families. War kill everyone's families. McCarthy looked at her with something like wonder. When did you get so wise?
When I drink Coca-Cola and remember my brother, she said with a sad smile.
When I taste chocolate and understand all the things we were never allowed to have. When I eat warm food and realize the enemy treats us better than our own military did. She paused. James, you ask why I cry that first day? Not just because I miss Kenji. I cry because if America has Coca-Cola and chocolate and warm food for everyone, even for prisoners, even for enemies, then what were we fighting for? What did Kenji die for? What did anyone die for? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable and terrible. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and cold. The decision had been made by the base commander over Captain Harrison's objections. The Japanese women would be included in the dinner, but attendance was voluntary for everyone. No one would be forced to sit with former enemies if they couldn't. Stomach it. The mess hall was decorated with paper turkeys and cornucopias, strange American symbols that the Japanese women didn't understand, but found charming in their innocence. Long tables were set up with white tablecloths, real silverware, and centerpieces made of autumn leaves. The smell of roasting turkey filled the air, along with unfamiliar scents of pumpkin pie, cranberry sauce, and sweet potatoes. The Japanese women entered nervously, wearing their best clothes, mostly still the worn military uniforms they'd been captured in, but cleaned and pressed with pride. About half the American soldiers were already seated, and the silence was deafening as the women filed in. Captain Harrison sat at a far table, his face like stone, surrounded by men who shared his anger. But then Sergeant Miller stood up from his table and motioned to the empty seats around him. Ladies, please join us. We've got plenty of room and plenty of food. Private McCarthy jumped up too, along with a dozen other soldiers who'd befriended the women over the past months. Slowly, hesitantly, the Japanese women sat down, integrating with the Americans in a way that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. The base chaplain said a prayer, translated by Sachiko, about gratitude, peace, and hope for the future. Then the food came out, and the Japanese women's eyes went wide. Turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing, green beans, rolls, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, apple pie. More food than any of them had seen in years, possibly ever. This wasn't just a meal. This was abundance beyond imagination. Lieutenant Yamada, sitting next to Sergeant Miller, stared at her full plate with something like shock. This is for one person? Yes, ma'am. And there's seconds if you want them. Seconds. She repeated the word like it was from a foreign language. In Japan, we ration every grain of rice. Children go hungry. Old people volunteer to die to save food for others. And here you have seconds. Miller looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, I know this must seem wrong, Yamada interrupted. It seems wrong. Not because you have it, but because we didn't understand how much you had. We were told America was weak, starving, that your people were suffering. We were told you couldn't sustain a war. But you were eating like this while we were eating grass soup. You were drinking Coca-Cola while our children died of malnutrition. How do we reconcile that? How do we go home and tell people the truth? That we lost because the enemy had so much they could waste it on prisoners? The table fell silent. Other nearby conversations died as people turned to listen. Even Captain Harrison was watching now, his face unreadable. You tell them it doesn't have to be this way, a voice said. Everyone turned to see a young American soldier standing. Private First Class David Chen, a Chinese-American whose family had fled Nanking. You tell them that having enough food doesn't make you evil. That prosperity doesn't mean weakness. That maybe, just maybe, there's a different way forward. One where Japan rebuilds not for war but for peace. Where kids can dream about Coca-Cola and actually taste it. Where mothers don't have to watch their children starve. His voice grew stronger. My grandparents fled China because of the Japanese invasion. They'd want me to hate you, but sitting here looking at you, you're just people who got lied to, same as we all did. So yeah, we have seconds. We have abundance. Maybe instead of resenting it, you take it home as proof that there's a better way. The silence that followed was profound. Then, from across the room, Captain Harrison stood up. Everyone tensed, expecting an explosion. Instead, he walked slowly to the table where Yuki sat, his face carved from granite. He looked down at her for a long moment. I lost 18 men on Iwo Jima, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Good men. Boys, really. One of them was 19 years old, engaged to be married. His name was Thomas Riley from Boston. Japanese artillery got him. He bled out in my arms asking for his mother. He paused, his jaw working. I can't sit with you. I can't break bread with you, not yet. Maybe not ever, but... He took a deep breath. Sergeant Miller is right. You're not the soldiers who killed Tommy. You're not the generals who started this war. You're just people, and people deserve to eat on Thanksgiving. He turned to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, I hope you get home safe. I hope your families are alive. I hope you find peace because God knows none of us have. He walked out, and the mess hall erupted in a mixture of emotion. Some crying, some arguing, some just sitting in stunned silence. But the Thanksgiving dinner continued. The women ate turkey and learned about American traditions. The soldiers answered questions and shared stories. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was a beginning. As the evening wound down and the women prepared to return to their barracks, Yuki found McCarthy one last time. She was carrying a bottle of Coca-Cola. She'd learned to love them, to save them, to ration them out like precious treasures. James, she said, using his first name for the first time. When I go home, when we all go home, what do I tell people about America? About Americans? About everything? McCarthy thought about it for a long time. Tell them the truth, he finally said. Tell them we're not perfect. Tell them we're not savages either. Tell them that we won the war, but nobody really wins a war. Everybody just loses less, he smiled sadly. And tell them about the Coca-Cola. Tell them how something as simple as a cold drink made you remember your brother and made you cry and made you realize that maybe the enemy wasn't so different after all. Tell them that maybe next time we should try talking before we try killing. What if they don't believe me? Then you drink a Coca-Cola and remember that it's true anyway. Remember that kindness is real even when the world says it isn't. Remember that James McCarthy from Iowa and Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo shared chocolate and became friends even though a war said they should be enemies. Remember all of it, and don't let anyone tell you it didn't matter. Yuki nodded, tears streaming down her face one last time. I will remember. I promise. For Kenji, for Danny, for everyone. And she did. When Yuki finally returned to Japan 6 months later, aboard a crowded repatriation ship, she carried with her 4 empty Coca-Cola bottles, 3 Hershey's chocolate wrappers, and a photograph that Private McCarthy had given her, a picture of him and his brother Danny, both smiling, both young, both alive. She kept these treasures for the rest of her life, showed them to her children and grandchildren, and told them the story of how the enemy gave her Coca-Cola and taught her that even in war, humanity could survive. The bottle sat on her shelf for 60 years. A reminder that sweetness could exist in the darkest times, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply being kind to someone you were supposed to hate.